Deep within the echoes of time, the forgotten files awake.
Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're opening the oldest storybook in the Western world, one filled with gods and monsters, heroes and riddles, love, war, and everything in between. This is Greek mythology explained from beginning to end. We'll wander through Mount Olympus, the depths of the underworld, the edges of the earth and sea, and all the tangled myths that try to make sense of life, death, nature, and fate. As always, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're unwinding under a quiet sky or gently falling asleep, I hope this helps your thoughts drift a little softer tonight. This is a story shaped by firelight and memory, passed down for thousands of years, and tonight it's all yours. In the beginning, there was nothing. Not the kind of nothing that comes after something, not a quiet void or a dark sea waiting to be filled, but true absence. No earth, no sky, no time, no gods, no men, not even silence. This was chaos, the formless beginning, not a deity as later poets would personify, but a state of being that defied comprehension, a presence of absence that held in it the seed of everything. And out of this yawning chasm, stirred by forces unknowable and older than eternity, came the first stirrings of form. Gaia, the earth, was the first to emerge, not born of any womb, not shaped by hand or will, but simply appearing as foundation and mother, vast and steady and eternal. With her came Tartarus, the deep and dreadful pit beneath all things, and Eros, the binding force of attraction, who would later wear the guise of love, but in truth was something older and more ruthless, the pull that draws everything toward everything else. From them came Nyx, the endless night, and Erebus, the darkness that lingered at the edge of creation. The world had not yet begun, and already it was a place of mystery and shadow, a realm born not of reason, but of raw, unrelenting force. Gaia, vast and alone, gave birth to Uranus, the sky, her equal in majesty and scope, a dome of glittering stars cast above her soil. He was not shaped with arms or voice, but he was power and presence, and together, earth and sky became the first parents. Uranus lay over Gaia, cloaking her, pressing against her, an intimacy without tenderness. Their union produced strange and terrible children, beings of unrefined power and elemental violence. The first were the Titans, 12 in number, immense and radiant, each embodying some great force of nature or fate. Then came the Cyclopes, giants with a single blazing eye set in the middle of their brows, smiths of thunder and fire, and lastly, the Hecatonchires, beings of such unspeakable strength, they were born with 100 arms and 50 heads each, monstrous and wild, their very existence an insult to harmony. Uranus beheld these children with loathing. They were too strong, too strange, too full of potential, and he feared them, feared the power they carried, the chaos they might unleash, the future they could shape without him. In his dread, he did what all tyrants do when they cannot destroy what they fear. He hid it away. He thrust the Cyclops and Hecatonchires deep into Gaia's belly, burying them within her own flesh, imprisoning them in Tartarus, denying them the sky, the light, the chance to rise. Gaia groaned beneath the weight of her buried children, not just with physical pain, but with the outrage of a mother whose womb had been turned into a prison. Her cries echoed across the unformed world, and in her grief and fury she began to plot. She forged a weapon in secret, an adamantine sickle, jagged and cruel, and she approached her Titan sons with a proposition. She offered them a chance to strike down their father, to seize his place, to unmake the reign of Uranus. Yet of the 12, only one stepped forward. Cronus, youngest of the Titans but boldest, most cunning, most ambitious, accepted the blade and the burden. One night, when Uranus descended once again to blanket Gaia in his eternal embrace, Cronus rose from hiding. With a swift and merciless stroke, he castrated his father, and the sky shuddered with the sound of divine agony. Uranus's blood fell upon Gaia, soaking the earth, and from it sprang new terrors, the Furies, shrieking spirits of vengeance, the giants, massive and wild, and Aphrodite herself, born not from love, but from violence, rising from the foam where flesh met sea. Cronus stood triumphant, the sickle still wet in his hands, his father cast down, the heavens torn. He claimed his place as king of the cosmos, ruling beside his sister and queen, Rhea. He had ended his father's tyranny and inaugurated what would later be called the Golden Age, a time of peace and plenty. But peace bought with blood carries its own curse, and in the eyes of the world, Cronus was not savior, but usurper. He had wounded the sky and broken the sacred bond of parent and child. And though Uranus fell into silence, his final breath was not one of forgiveness, but of prophecy. With his dying voice, he promised that Cronus too would fall by the hand of his own offspring, that the cycle of betrayal would not end but deepen. And so the throne changed hands. The age turned, but the stain remained. The world had been born in violence, and its kings, whether of sky or stone, would always rule with one eye fixed behind them, watching the cradle. The throne of the universe, if such a thing could be said to exist in the haze of those earliest ages, now passed to Cronus, the Titan who had dared to raise his hand against the sky itself. The sickle that had severed Uranus's manhood and power was buried now, not in earth or stone, but in memory, its sharp edge dulled not by time, but by the silence of those who had watched and said nothing. Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, and the only one bold enough, or foolish enough, to challenge the authority of a father who had once wrapped the entire world in his oppressive embrace, now stood alone at the summit of creation, crowned not with gold, but with the dripping blood of his progenitor. The act had not made him greater than Uranus, it had made him the same. And in the deep shadows of Gaia's grief, where the Furies still shrieked and the Cyclopes remained buried, Cronus declared a new order. He promised his kin that the age of terror had ended, that the tyranny of Uranus would be remembered only as a caution to kings who loved power more than their own flesh and blood. But in truth, the young Titan king feared the same whispers that had driven his father mad, that a child of his own would rise one day to cast him down, just as he had done to his father, and that the cycle of blood and betrayal would stretch onward, an unbreakable curse passed from God to God like a poisoned crown. He took Rhea as his queen, not from love or affection, but because she was his equal in divine stature, a sister born of the same womb, tempered in the same agony. She was beautiful and formidable, her eyes full of the depthless calm that only those born from Gaia's own bones could possess, and for a time she believed in the peace he promised. Their union brought forth a new generation, the first of the Olympians, and in each child lay the spark of something different, something unshaped and radiant, something neither wholly Titan nor entirely other. But Cronus could not look upon these newborns without hearing the voice of Uranus hissing from the depths of Tartarus, promising vengeance through the very mouths of the infants that cried in the arms of his wife. Each time Rhea brought a child into the world, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Cronus came, cloaked not in celebration but in fear. He did not cradle them, did not bless them, or name them. He swallowed them, whole, alive, without a sound. He pressed their small warm bodies to his lips and drew them into the eternal black of his stomach, turning his own blood into prisoners inside his flesh. He called it wisdom. He called it safety. But it was terror, ancient and choking, passed from father to son like a funeral shroud, and with each devouring, the chill of prophecy tightened around his heart. Rhea, bound by fate and marriage, bore this in silence at first. Her cries were swallowed along with her children, her rage buried beneath a queenly exterior that gave no hint of the storm gathering within. She watched as her brothers and sisters, the other Titans, stood idle, unwilling to challenge Cronus, each afraid that to speak out would be to invite the same fate that befell Uranus. Some whispered behind closed lips that perhaps Cronus had done what was necessary, that a king must be merciless to preserve his reign. Others, like Oceanus, withdrew from the intrigues of Olympus altogether, retreating to the farthest reaches of their domains, where the tremors of the past could not reach them. But Gaia saw, and she remembered, and the earth groaned once again, though this time not from the weight of her children's imprisonment, but from the slow growing wrath of a mother who had outlived too many kings. When Rhea became pregnant a fifth time, she turned not to her husband, not to her siblings, but to the earth herself. Gaia, who had once armed Cronus with the sickle that unmade Uranus, now offered her daughter-in-law the weapons of deceit and hope. When the time came to deliver, Rhea did not go to the halls of Cronus, but fled in secret to a cave nestled in the cliffs of Mount Dicte, on the rugged island of Crete, where the winds howled and the stones whispered, and no eyes of Titans could follow. There, in shadow and secrecy, she bore a son, her sixth child, whom she named Zeus, a name that would one day shake the pillars of the world. And when Cronus came to claim what he believed was his due, Rhea swaddled a stone in cloth, rough and silent, and held it out with steady hands. Cronus took it without question, without care, and swallowed it just as he had the others. And with that simple act of blind destruction, he condemned himself. Zeus was raised in silence, far from the eyes of the heavens. The nymphs and the goat Amalthea fed and guarded him, and the Curetes, warrior spirits with bronze armor and clashing shields, danced and shouted and pounded their blades so that the cries of the infant would never reach the ears of Cronus. As the boy grew, so too did the ancient rhythm of fate. The child who suckled on honey and goat's milk in a hidden cave would one day walk among gods and demand recompense for every brother and sister swallowed whole. Cronus, unaware, ruled on, his gut a prison, his throne a borrowed victory. The Titans worshipped him, mortals. Few and primitive spoke of him with awe, and Rhea, composed and quiet, held her tongue and waited for the day when her true son would return. For no king rules forever, not Uranus, not Cronus, not even the ones who believe they have silenced prophecy with a single swallow. And so the Golden Age endured, not as a time of peace, but as a dream built on the bones of infants and the silence of a queen. The skies were bright, and the earth was rich, but beneath every harvest lay a whisper of unease, a murmur in the soil, a tremor in the wind. Gaia watched. Rhea endured. Zeus grew. And Cronus, seated on a throne of swallowed futures, never once realized that he was already undone. Cronus sat upon his throne at the peak of the world, crowned not with laurels nor bound in glory, but enthroned by blood, by betrayal, and by the silence that followed a father's fall. He ruled from the high reaches of Olympus, and the earth beneath him was golden, or so it seemed to those who did not look too closely. The rivers ran clear, the seasons turned as they should, and the harvests were full. But there was a stillness beneath the beauty, a hush that clung to the roots of trees and the hearts of gods, a silence born of swallowed children and prophecies unspoken aloud. The Golden Age, so often remembered in song and legend as a time of plenty, was in truth an age of dread, where the king of all things lived in constant fear of the future, haunted by the same shadow that had brought down his father before him. The difference was only in the method. Where Uranus had cast his sons into the bowels of the world, Cronus consumed his. And if there is a difference between a prison of stone and one of flesh, it mattered little to those locked within. Every time Rhea bore him a child, Cronus came to her chamber, not with the joy of a father or the reverence of a king, but with the cold resolve of a man who believed that destiny could be devoured like meat. He did not marvel at their small faces or their first breaths. He did not name them, nor cradle them in his arms. He took them in silence and swallowed them whole. Hestia, the firstborn, goddess of the hearth, who never saw flame. Demeter, the nourisher, whose touch never once met the fields. Hera, proud and terrible, who would one day become queen herself, but now only slipped away down her father's throat like a dream. Each child vanished, absorbed into Cronus's body, not dead, not alive, simply silenced, kept suspended in a kind of divine stasis, as if the Titan thought that so long as they did not draw breath beneath the open sky, they could never grow, never rebel, never fulfill the prophecy that clawed at the back of his mind like a beast at a locked door. The Titan court whispered behind polished marble and sacred pillars, their voices hushed and uncertain. None dared name what they knew. Cronus ruled with a heavy hand and a paranoid heart. He gave orders with iron finality, and his word was law, but there was a madness in his eyes. Subtle, buried deep, but spreading like mold in the corner of a palace wall. Rhea, once radiant with divine promise, now wore sorrow like a shroud. Her belly grew round again, and each time she screamed in labor, it was not followed by lullaby or celebration, only the footsteps of her husband coming to claim what he believed was his right. She wept, but her tears changed nothing. She begged Gaia, but the earth offered no relief, not yet. She turned to her sisters, to her brothers, but they averted their eyes. He Titans, old and mighty as they were, had learned from Uranus's fall that defying the king could bring ruin to all. Better to remain still, better to wait, better to let Rhea bear the weight of destiny alone. It was a kingdom of stasis. The Titans ruled the cosmos, but the world did not change. No new gods were born into light. No new realms were given shape. No great works were forged. The world held its breath, and in that breathless silence, Cronus mistook stillness for safety. He believed he had won. He had broken fate with his own jaws, swallowed prophecy, and silenced the cries of rebellion before they could rise. But he was wrong, for the child he had not swallowed, the boy Rhea had hidden, the one suckled in secret by nymphs in a Cretan cave, was growing, and with each passing year, he became more than a secret. He became inevitable. But Cronus did not know this. He paced his high halls and drank sweet nectar from golden cups. And from his throne of bone and stone, he dreamed of eternity. He feared sleep. He feared the sound of crying babes. He feared every dream that ended with a hand on his throat or a blade in his back. He feared time itself, though he was time's personification. And most of all, he feared the thing he had once been, the son who rose in the shadow of a tyrant and dared to strike. He saw his own reflection in every pool and puddle, and behind that reflection, always, the vague outline of a figure yet to come. Rhea, meanwhile, said nothing more. Her face became stone, her eyes distant. She sat beside him in court and played the part of the loyal queen. But in her heart, she carried a secret like fire, a tiny ember wrapped in cloth and hidden in a cave. And every time Cronus passed by her, with his brow furrowed and his shoulders tense, she would smile ever so slightly, for she knew what he did not. The child lived, and he would not remain hidden forever. It began, as most wars do, not with fanfare or declaration, but with silence, breaking under the weight of truth. Zeus had grown tall in secret, his limbs strong with the strength of mountain stone and wild milk, his eyes sharp with the knowledge that he had been hidden, that his birthright had been devoured, that his mother had wept and lied and risked the wrath of a king so that he might live. He did not grow up with the softness of courtly love or the laziness of noble heirs. He was raised by nymphs in the dark hollows of Crete, fed by wild honey and guarded by the constant din of clashing swords and stomping feet, as the curettes banged their shields and danced in warlike frenzy, masking his infant cries from the heavens above. He learned to listen before he spoke, to observe before he acted, to wait until the hour was right. And when it came, he did not hesitate. He climbed the heights of Olympus not as a supplicant, but as a son long denied. And he did not bring gifts or apologies. He brought vengeance. Cronus, never fully at peace, never truly asleep, never wholly unaware, did not recognize the young man before him as his own. Perhaps it was because he had forgotten the feel of his children's faces. Perhaps because prophecy always takes the shape we least expect. Or perhaps it was fear itself that blinded him, the fear that had driven him to swallow the future, only to find that fate, unlike flesh, cannot be digested. Zeus stood before him, and with a calm smile and a voice that did not tremble, offered his father a cup. It was laced with a concoction of divine bile and cunning, crafted not by chance, but with careful study, learned in the shadows from Gaia herself, and whispered by those who remembered what had come before. Cronus drank, as he always had, believing he consumed power, believing still that he could control what had never truly belonged to him. And then he staggered, and then he choked, and then he vomited. One by one the children swallowed, long ago emerged, not as infants, but as gods. Hestia, serene and watchful. Demeter, earthy and vengeful. Hera, regal and wrathful. Hades, dark and brooding. And Poseidon, wild as the seas that bore his name. They rose from the Titan's insides like ghosts released from a tomb, fully grown and full of the memory of darkness. They did not thank him. They did not weep. They stood beside Zeus, shoulder to shoulder, the 6 children of Cronus at last together, not as a family, but as an army. What followed was not a war in the way mortals wage them. It was not fought for land or pride, or even vengeance alone. It was a war of eras, of orders, of the old against the new, of a world that had grown weary against one that had not yet begun. The Titanomachy, as it would come to be known, raged for 10 years, though time then was still being invented, and the passing of days was measured more by the screams of mountains and the boiling of seas than by sunrises or seasons. Zeus led the charge with thunder in his fists and a voice that shook the sky. Poseidon tore open the rivers and hurled tidal waves across enemy lines. Hades split the ground and drew forth the shadows that clung to the feet of the dying. And their father, Cronus, once the usurper and now the besieged, called upon his brothers and sisters, the ancient Titans who still ruled the corners of the cosmos, to hold the line against the rising storm. At first, it seemed the old gods would prevail. The Titans had age, strength, and dominion over all the natural forces. They wielded time and memory like swords, and their fury was not hot like the rage of youth, but cold and enduring, carved from eons of divine supremacy. But they lacked unity. They lacked vision. They had grown accustomed to power and could not imagine a world in which it might be taken. Cronus fought with desperation, not purpose, and the other Titans followed not from love, but from obligation. Some, like wise Themis and clever Prometheus, saw the writing on the wall and abandoned the Titan cause early, offering their wisdom and cunning to the rebel gods in hopes that they might shape the world to come. And then came the shift, the moment upon which all victory turned. At Gaia's urging, Zeus descended into the deepest chasm of the world and freed the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed giants buried by Uranus long ago, and their Cyclopean brothers who had not seen light since the dawn of time. Forgotten by their kin, cursed and chained in Tartarus for crimes they had never committed, they rose now with a vengeance that shook the very teeth of the underworld. In gratitude and fury, the Cyclopes forged for Zeus his lightning, for Poseidon the trident that broke the sea, and for Hades the helm of shadow that made him a ghost upon the battlefield. The Hecatonchires, with 50 arms on each side, hurled mountains like pebbles and shattered the Titan phalanxes with a storm of stone and shrieking steel. The final battle was fought on the plains of Thessaly, though in those days it bore no name. The sky darkened until it was a vault of flame. Mountains crumbled and rivers fled their beds. The gods fought not with armies, but with the elements themselves. Lightning cracked the sky into shards. Oceans rose and fell in a single breath. Fire poured from the earth and was swallowed by wind. In the center of it all stood Zeus, cloaked in thunder, hurling bolts from his fists with the precision of a butcher. Cronus met him at last, not as a father greeting his son, but as a king staring down the storm he had tried to outrun. They clashed in the ruins of a world not yet made, and when it was over, Cronus fell, not slain, but broken, cast down, and chained in the darkness beneath all things. His brothers were bound beside him in Tartarus, behind gates wrought of adamantine, and watched over by monsters forged in battle. There would be no clemency, no mercy. The old gods were buried where no light could reach, and the world gasped in silence. Zeus and his siblings stood amidst the smoking wreckage of a cosmos torn open and resewn. The war was won, but the cost had been immeasurable. The air itself seemed quieter now, as if it feared what the victors might do next. There was no cheering, no feast, only the long exhale of fate, a breath that had been held since the moment Gaia bore Uranus and the world began. And in that silence, the new gods began to divide the spoils. The heavens were given to Zeus, who had shattered the sky and claimed dominion over storm and justice. The sea was granted to Poseidon, who now walked the tides as a lord walks his keep. And the underworld, silent and vast, was entrusted to Hades, who had tasted darkness and found it fitting. The earth itself, and all who walked upon it, belonged to no one and everyone at once. The Titans were imprisoned, the Hecatonchires kept watch, the Cyclopes returned to their forges, and the 6 gods, the children of Cronus and Rhea, stood as the new rulers of existence, not by right, not by love, but by fire and war and the inescapable turning of time. Thus ended the reign of the Titans and began the rule of the Olympians. The world had not been remade, it had been claimed. And though the war was over, the story of the gods had only just begun. The war was over, but the wounds it carved had yet to scar. The heavens still smelled of lightning. The mountains still bore the claw marks of giants, and the seas had not yet remembered their quiet. When the ash settled and the screams fell silent, the victors looked upon the battered world not with triumph, but with the weight of inheritance. The Olympians had not inherited peace, they had inherited its ruins. The old order had been pulled down by force, not replaced by wisdom, and the gods who now sat upon the thrones of the sky, the sea, and the underworld had known nothing but struggle, rebellion, and blood. Zeus, the youngest of them, yet now the first among them, ascended not because he was beloved, nor because he was most just, but because he was the storm. He had brought down Cronus with thunder, had shattered the Titans with fire, had wielded force as deftly as a mason wields a chisel, and the world had yielded to him, not in affection, but in awe. Zeus claimed the heavens for his own, lifting his throne above the clouds, ringed in cold fire and crowned with stormlight. From there, he looked down upon all things, earth, sea, and the black depths below, and he named himself king. His voice became law, his glance became fate, and his anger became legend. Poseidon, though fierce and proud, took the sea without quarrel, for the ocean had always answered to no one, and only he among the gods could hear its shifting moods and fury. Hades, quieter still, turned his back on the sun and descended willingly into the underworld, not in shame or exile, but in grim acceptance of what was his to rule. The earth remained shared, though none of them trusted the balance. Olympus rose as their stronghold, carved of cloud and stone, unreachable by mortal hand, wrapped in the light of eternity, and there the gods began to shape the new order. But order, like power, is brittle when young, and cracks soon ran beneath its surface. Though his siblings stood beside him and the Titans lay bound, Zeus could not forget the voice of his father, broken and fading, whispering of betrayal. He could not silence the echo of Uranus's last curse, or the prophecy that had gnawed through Cronus's belly and now crept like rot through the root of his own reign. The old wound reopened in a new shape, that one day Zeus too would fall, struck down not by a foe from without, but by blood of his own blood, a child greater than the father, born not yet, fated to rise. And Zeus, though mightier than Cronus, though louder than the sky and crueler than the sea, was still a son who had once held a poisoned cup and watched a king choke on his own legacy. He would not allow that history to repeat, not again. So when he took his first wife, Metis, the clever titaness of wisdom, whose thoughts could twist like rivers and whose mind rivaled the fates themselves, he did so not with love in his heart, but with a careful and guarded curiosity. She was no war bride, no spoil, no prisoner. She was an equal in thought, and Zeus admired her counsel. But when the oracles whispered that Meti would bear him a daughter of great wisdom, and then a son mightier than he, a child who would overthrow him and bring the Olympian age to its knees. He did not hesitate. Zeus opened his mouth and swallowed Metis whole, not out of malice, but out of fear. He consumed her in the same way Cronus had consumed him, the same way Uranus had buried his monstrous sons, believing, wrongly, that fate could be silenced if its voice was devoured before it could speak. Yet fate is not a songbird that can be caged, nor a whisper that can be eaten. Fate is a river that runs under all things, and the more one fights it, the more one drowns. From within his skull, Metis did not die. She whispered, she forged, she planned. And in time, as Zeus ruled and thundered and tried to forget what he had done, he was struck not with rebellion from without, but with pain from within, a cracking pressure behind his eyes that no god could soothe. The agony drove him mad, and it was only when Hephaestus, god of the forge, split his skull with an axe that the prophecy burst forth in full glory. Athena, born not of womb, but of mind, clad in armor, radiant with wisdom, sword already drawn. A child of war and thought, born fully grown, undaunted, unshaken. She did not rebel, she did not rage. She stood by his side and bowed her head, and for a time Zeus believed the curse broken. There was no son. He had taken the future and bent it to his will. But fate had not finished with him. From the depths of the earth, no, from deeper still, from beneath the bones of the world, from a place older than Titans, older even than Gaia's waking, came a sound. Not a roar, not a cry, not even a word. A windless howl, a pressure in the blood, a memory of terror that every god felt but none could name. For Cronus had been defeated, yes, and the Titans locked away. But Gaia, wounded by the war against her sons, had birthed a final vengeance. Something no god, no Titan, no mortal thing had ever beheld. Typhon, the last monster, the storm of all storms, the fire that eats thunder. He rose with serpent legs that wrapped the earth, with wings that blackened the sky, with 100 voices shrieking in tongues no living thing could speak. The Olympians fled at first, even the gods, even those who had broken mountains and boiled oceans, ran, their weapons slipping from fingers not used to fear. Only Zeus stood his ground. The battle between Zeus and Typhon did not take place in time. It shattered it. It tore the fabric of the world, boiled rivers to air, scorched forests into ash, knocked stars from the sky and hurled them into the sea. Typhon's breath was smoke and madness. His arms were lightning, his body a mountain of chaos. But Zeus, the thunderer, king of heaven, summoned every bolt he had ever known, every shard of fury he had ever buried, and hurled them in a storm that split the continents. It was not might that won the day, but wrath, pure, unrelenting, divine wrath. In the end, Zeus cast down Typhon, burying the beast beneath Mount Etna, where fire still spills from the ground and the earth still groans under his weight. And in doing so, Zeus proved not just that he was king, but that he was the storm. Yet even as Olympus rose again, and the gods returned to their thrones, nothing was quite the same. The sky had held its breath, the earth had trembled, and Zeus, for all his power, for all his victories, could no longer pretend that the age of gods would pass in peace. He had swallowed a wife. He had fought a monster. He had bent prophecy and broken the world. And still, the future waited. Somewhere out there, unseen and unborn, the next betrayal already stirred. The sky had been tamed, the Titans were in chains, and the monsters of the deep had been buried beneath stone and ash. But for all his victories, Zeus could not escape the itch that power always brings, the quiet, gnawing knowledge that rule is never truly complete unless it commands the smallest things as surely as it commands the greatest. It was not enough for Zeus to be king of Olympus, not enough to wield lightning and silence monsters. He now turned his eye downward, toward the fragile, mortal creatures crawling along the earth's surface. Men and women who lived and died in cycles of pain and hunger, their bodies frail, their years short, their understanding as dim as starlight in fog. They were no threat, not in strength or ambition, not yet, but Zeus, who had seen how prophecies were born from even the weakest of things, believed the danger was not in what they were, but in what they might become, and so he began to limit them. He denied them the secrets of fire, that holy and dangerous spark stolen from the heart of heaven, the flame that warmed, forged, cooked, and killed. Fire was divine. It belonged to gods and smiths and stars. In the hands of mortals, Zeus feared it would become a ladder, and every ladder was a danger to a throne. He decreed that mankind would live in cold and darkness, feeding on raw flesh, crouching in caves, dying in winters that never forgave weakness. He watched them huddle like insects, and where others might have pitied, Zeus saw only precaution. He believed the world was now in balance, order above, struggle below, and he had no interest in changing that. But not all gods agreed. Prometheus, a titan by birth and exile by choice, had not fought for Cronus during the war. He had stood apart, watching both sides tear the world in half, calculating, listening, learning. He was not made of storm or sea or fire. He was made of foresight. And what he foresaw now was a species abandoned, not because it had failed, but because the gods feared it might someday succeed. Prometheus had walked among men in the early days, not as a ruler, but as a guide. He had shaped them from clay, molded their limbs with tenderness, taught them names, language, thought. He loved them, not as a god loves a worshipper, but as a craftsman loves his work, as a teacher loves a student who does not yet know what he could become. And when he saw them suffer, not from weakness, but from deliberate deprivation, he acted. One night, cloaked in smoke and secrecy, Prometheus ascended to Olympus. He passed the halls of the gods, quiet as the wind, and entered the forge of Hephaestus, where the sacred fire blazed behind golden grates. And there, without apology or fear, he stole it. A single ember, hidden in a fennel stalk, carried down from heaven to earth like the spark of rebellion itself. And when he brought it to mankind, when he placed the flame in their trembling hands and watched their eyes fill with light, he knew what he had done. He had defied a king. He had raised the low. He had shifted the balance of the world. The fire spread. The world changed. Where once there had been caves, now there were hearths. Where once there had been raw meat, now there were pots of boiling grain. Where once there had been silence, now there were stories, songs, bronze blades, and smouldering coals that burned not only wood, but ignorance. Mankind rose quickly, faster than the gods expected. They tamed animals, tilled soil, carved temples, and lit bonfires that rivaled stars. And Zeus, watching all this from his cold throne, was enraged, not by the theft, but by its success, for the flame had not killed them, it had awakened them. Zeus summoned Prometheus and offered him a chance to kneel, to explain, to show remorse for what he had done. Prometheus did not kneel. He spoke plainly, without fear, and told Zeus that the world belonged not only to the immortals, but to the mortals as well. That mankind, though small and mortal and brief, was capable of greatness beyond divine imagining, if only they were given the tools to reach it. Zeus listened. and when Prometheus finished, Zeus said nothing. He merely nodded to his guards, and they took the Titan away. They dragged him to the edge of the world, to a mountain so high the clouds bled against its peak, and there they chained him, naked and alone, to a stone that felt no pity. With adamantine links they bound his limbs, and for his crime of compassion, they sentenced him not to death, but to endless punishment. Each morning, a great eagle would descend, talons black as judgment, and tear into his belly to devour his liver. And each night, as the sun dipped beneath the curve of the sky, the organ would grow back, full and raw, ready to be eaten again. There was no rest, no release, only pain and the slow erosion of time. And through it all, Prometheus never screamed. He did not beg. He endured. For he had given humanity fire, and he knew, in his blood and bones, that they would not forget. But Zeus was not finished. Prometheus had been punished, but the mortals still burned their fires and sang their songs. And so the king of the gods decided to strike not with thunder, but with gifts. He would destroy them not with flood or plague, but with beauty. He summoned Hephaestus, the divine smith, and ordered him to mold a woman from earth and grace. Every god added something to her. Aphrodite gave her charm, Hermes gave her cunning, Athena gave her skill, Apollo gave her music. She was radiant, dazzling, clever beyond measure. She was named Pandora, meaning all gifted, and she was sent not as a bride, not as a blessing, but as a weapon. She carried with her a jar, some say a box, that she was told never to open. She was given to Epimetheus, Prometheus's duller brother, who, in his loneliness and longing, accepted her without question. He ignored his brother's warnings, forgot his caution, and fell in love with the thing crafted to destroy him. And so, Pandora lived among men, smiled, sang, and watched. But curiosity too had been placed inside her, whether as a flaw or a feature, none could say. One day, unable to resist the whisper of the sealed jar, she opened it, and from it poured every sorrow the world has ever known. Disease, which rots the body, grief, which darkens the soul, jealousy, which poisons love, famine, madness, war, old age, death, all of them surged out in a black storm, filling the corners of the earth and coiling around every heart. Men who had sung now wept. Women who had danced now buried their children. The world, once full of fire and promise, became a place of suffering. The gods looked on, some with triumph, others with pity, and Zeus watched with cold satisfaction as humanity bent under the weight of what it had been given. But not everything had escaped. At the bottom of the jar, unnoticed in the chaos, one thing remained. When Pandora peered inside, trembling, she found it, small and flickering, like a flame nearly smothered, fragile as a breath in winter. Hope. She let it out. It rose into the sky, weak but defiant, and drifted among the ashes. It could not undo what had been done. It could not close the wounds, but it stayed. And wherever sorrow took root, hope grew beside it, stubborn and quiet and everlasting. And so the age changed. Mortals had fire, but they also had pain. They had thought, but they also had grief. They walked upright, with open eyes, but they wept as they walked. The gods, high on Olympus, had ensured that mankind would never rise too far, too fast, but they had also ensured that mankind would never again bow in simple, silent fear. The world had become a harder place, but it had also become a world worth fighting for. The age that followed was neither golden nor pure. It was not carved in the shining marble of Olympus, nor lost in the black rot of Tartarus, but forged somewhere in between, in the smoke-choked valleys and sunlit hills of the mortal world, where men tilled soil and feared the night, where gods wandered in secret, cloaked in mortal skin, their hearts restless, their appetites boundless. The world, though ruled from the high halls of Olympus, was no longer shaped solely by immortal hands. The gods had tasted war, had felt the cut of betrayal, and had seen the embers of fire catch in the hearts of men. They descended more often now, not out of duty or justice, but out of boredom, out of desire, out of sheer divine arrogance. And when gods walked among mortals, mortals trembled, or burned, or changed forever. They left behind not just ruin or blessing, but blood, divine blood, and with it, the world changed again. These children, born of sky and soil, of thunder and bone, were neither fully mortal nor fully divine. They did not sit on thrones in Olympus, but neither did they die like other men. They were heroes, though the word in those days meant something harder, rougher, more terrible. A hero was not a savior. A hero was a force, a storm given a name. These children, born of sky and soil, of thunder and bone, were neither fully mortal nor fully divine. They did not sit on thrones in Olympus, but neither did they die like other men. They were heroes, though the word in those days meant something harder, rougher, more terrible. A hero was not a savior. A hero was a force, a storm given a name. They were born in strange places, raised in exile or secrecy or sorrow, and sent into the world like blades drawn from sheaths that the gods themselves had forged. They did not seek peace, they sought purpose. And the world, already broken by wars of gods and burned by divine vengeance, had no shortage of monsters for them to kill, nor kings for them to challenge, nor prophecies for them to fulfill. Perseus was the first among them, or at least the first whose tale echoed loud enough to survive the ages. He was born of Danae, a mortal princess imprisoned in a bronze chamber beneath the earth, locked away by her father, King Achilles, who had been told by an oracle that his daughter's son would be his doom. And yet, even locked in darkness, Danae could not escape fate, for Zeus himself came to her, not in human form but in a shower of golden light, slipping through the cracks of her prison and leaving her with child. When Achilles discovered the infant, he did not hesitate. He placed mother and son into a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, thinking perhaps the ocean could do what he would not, kill for him. But the sea, for once, showed mercy. The chest floated ashore on the island of Seriphos, and Perseus lived. He grew not in palaces, but in the rough courts of fishermen and bronze-bearded kings, with the scent of salt in his lungs and the weight of prophecy on his back. The gods watched him with distant interest. Athena whispered to him in dreams. Hermes watched his steps with the wariness of an older brother wary of a rival. And when Perseus was tricked by a tyrant king into promising an impossible gift, the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turned men to stone, it was not pity that moved the gods to aid him, but curiosity. They gave him winged sandals, a mirror-like shield, a sword that could cut through anything, and a helm that cloaked him in invisibility. He set out not as a man, but as a myth in the making, alone and armed with borrowed power. The path to Medusa was not paved in triumph. He passed through lands that stank of rot, crossed rivers that whispered secrets in tongues he did not know, and entered realms where time bent sideways and sleep brought visions of blood. When at last he found her, the cursed maiden, once a priestess of Athena, turned into a monster for the sin of being raped in the goddess's own temple, she did not roar or chase him. She slept. Her sisters hissed in the dark, and her serpents curled around her brow like a crown of regret. And Perseus, full of purpose and fear and youthful righteousness, raised his blade and struck her down. The blood sprayed in arcs that carved new rivers. Her head, still alive, still deadly, was tucked into a sack. Her eyes never closed. From her death came Pegasus, the winged horse who sprang from her severed neck, and Chrysaea, a giant born fully armed. From her death came legend. Perseus did not return home immediately. He wandered, as heroes do. He found Andromeda chained to a rock, a sacrifice to a sea monster sent by Poseidon, who had been insulted by her vain mother. Perseus slew the beast, claimed the girl, and with her, a kingdom. He returned to Seriphos to find the king who had wronged him threatening his mother, and with a flourish, he turned the tyrant to stone with Medusa's head. His victories piled high, like bones before a throne. But fate, as ever, was not yet finished. In time, Perseus returned to Argos, to the court of his grandfather. He did not come with an army. He did not come with vengeance. But Achilles, still afraid, fled. He traveled to Larissa, seeking peace or delay, and it was there during athletic games that Perseus, full of youth and pride, threw a discus that veered off course. It struck an old man in the crowd, shattered his skull, and killed him. The old man was Achilles. The prophecy had come true. The doom had been delayed, diverted, disguised, but never avoided. And thus was the tale of Perseus written, not as a story of justice, nor as one of revenge, but as a thread in the larger tapestry of myth, a tale that burned brightly and ended quietly, with the weight of fate resting heavy on the shoulders of a man who had slain monsters, rescued maidens, and crowned kingdoms, but could not escape the curse that came before he was born. He became a king, yes, and a founder of cities. His children spread across the Greek world, but he lived always with the knowledge that his greatest act had not been one of choice, but of accident, that even the chosen of the gods were still pieces on a board too vast to see. The world was changing. The line between gods and mortals had begun to blur, and Perseus, the first of the great heroes, walked that line with the dignity of a man who understood that glory was only ever borrowed, and that all stories, no matter how grand, ended in the same dark silence. In the wake of Perseus, the world remembered the shape of greatness. His name passed from mouth to mouth, sung beneath flickering hearths and whispered in the stillness before battle. And though no two tellings ever agreed, they all shared the same undercurrent, that a man born of God and woman could rise to slay horrors and shape kingdoms. The line between mortals and immortals had been breached, and from that tear in the veil spilled stories of others, born not just of prophecy, but of ambition, rage, and the ceaseless hunger of men who would not live and die in silence. In the generations that followed, heroes emerged like sparks from a flint stone, and among them was Theseus, son of Aegeus, prince of Athens, and perhaps of Poseidon, depending on which bard told the tale. He was not born with greatness, nor marked by divine visions, but he was clever and cunning, and cruel when the world required it, and in the age of heroes, that was often all the world required. His youth was a quiet one, spent in Troezen with his mother Aethra, away from the noise and burden of court. But the blood in his veins would not let him remain forgotten. When he came of age and learned the truth of his parentage, that he was a prince, that a sword and sandals had been left beneath a boulder by his father as both a test and a legacy, he did not hesitate. He lifted the stone, took what was his, and walked to Athens, not by sea as a prince might, but overland, through a wild and violent countryside littered with bandits, monsters, and would-be kings. And in that long and brutal journey, he forged himself. He crushed Periphetes the club-bearer, bent Sinis the pine-bender to death by his own trees, cast Siren to the man-eating turtles he had once fed. He met cruelty with cleverness and evil with equal malice, and each foe that fell before him left behind another tale, another name, another warning carved into the stone of the world. Theseus passed here. He arrived in Athens not as a boy claiming birthright, but as a conqueror. Yet no throne was freely given in that city. Aegeus, though king, was ensnared by sorcery and paranoia, married to the witch Medea, who saw in Theseus a threat to her power and tried, as all who fear the future do, to poison it before it could grow. But Theseus revealed his lineage in time, and Medea, unmasked, fled in fury. Athens accepted him then, not out of love, but out of awe. And it was then that Theseus learned of the tribute to Crete, the shame of Athens, the price of a lost war. Every 9 years, the city sent 7 young men and 7 maidens to King Minos, not for marriage or service, but for death. The youths were cast into the labyrinth, an endless maze beneath Knossos, where they were hunted and devoured by the Minotaur, a beast of muscle and horn, born from a queen's lust and a god's curse, kept as both punishment and pride. Theseus did not wait to be chosen. He volunteered. He sailed to Crete with the doomed, not weeping, but watchful. There he met Ariadne, daughter of Minos, who fell not in love with Theseus's face or name, but with the fire behind his words, the promise of defiance. She gave him a ball of thread, simple and sacred, a lifeline through the dark. And so he entered the labyrinth, not knowing if he would return. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of blood and damp stone, and the walls whispered the screams of those who had never found their way out. At the heart of it waited the Minotaur, a creature neither man nor beast, once a child, now a prisoner and executioner. They fought not with words or strategy, but with desperation. The battle was short and savage. Theseus killed the beast, not as a hero slaying a monster, but as a man murdering a memory, slashing it open with steel, watching its body twitch and fall in the silence of its own tomb. He escaped by Ariadne's thread, leading the children out of the maze, back to the sun, and boarded his ship as a savior. But the sea has a memory, and the gods are slow to forget. On the journey home, Theseus abandoned Ariadne, leaving her on the island of Naxos. Whether by divine compulsion or mortal coldness, none can say. She awoke alone, betrayed by the man she had saved, her thread unraveling in the salt wind. Dionysus would find her and raise her to the stars, but Theseus would carry the guilt for the rest of his days. His ship neared Athens, but he forgot, or chose not, to change his sails from black to white, the agreed-upon signal of his survival. His father, Aegeus, watching from the cliffs, saw the black sails and believed his son dead. In his grief, he leapt into the sea, which bears his name still. Theseus returned to a throne bathed in tears and crowned not by joy, but by mistake. He became king, yes, and a unifier of Attica, yes. But greatness is not goodness, and Theseus, though clever and brave, was not kind. He kidnapped Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, and bore a child by her. He later married Phaedra, Ariadne's sister, and when their lives unraveled in blood and lust and lies, It was his son Hippolytus who paid the price. Theseus's rule was long, but his victories were shadowed by betrayal, his legacy poisoned by the same ambition and carelessness that had once made him strong. He died far from Athens, exiled and forgotten, pushed from a cliff by a king he had once called a friend. No monument marked the spot. No thunder shook the skies. The monster slayers of that age, Perseus, Theseus, Bellerophon, Cadmus, each walked the same road, born of God and woman, tasked with impossible deeds, rising higher than mortal men could dream, only to fall further. Their stories do not end with peace or comfort. They end in silence, or madness, or exile. For the world they lived in did not forgive greatness. It used it, then cast it aside. And yet their names endured. Not because they were kind, not because they were just, but because they were necessary. In an age still haunted by the gods, still stalked by the beasts of an older world, these were the men who carved paths with blade and blood and fire. They were not the best of men, but they were the strongest. And for a time, that was enough. Before the war at Troy, before Achilles dragged a corpse behind his chariot, before Odysseus wandered the seas and kings butchered their daughters to please the wind, there was Heracles, the strongest of men, the most tormented of heroes, and the only mortal to claw his way into Olympus, not through prayer or favor or birthright, but through suffering so vast and strength so godlike that the gods themselves, in the end, had no choice but to name him their equal. He was not wise like Odysseus, nor proud like Agamemnon, nor cunning like Theseus, and his heart was not tender, nor was it cruel. He was what the world had made him, a weapon too mighty for peace and too noble for oblivion. The world did not offer him love, it gave him struggle, and he, in return, gave it legend. He was born in Thebes, the son of Alcmene, a mortal queen, and Zeus, who once again descended to earth not as thunder or fire, but in deceit, taking the form of Alcmene's husband, sleeping in her bed, planting a child that would carry heaven in his blood and sorrow in his fate. Hera, queen of gods and queen of vengeance, discovered the affair, as she always did, and her fury was not spent on Zeus, who would never stop, but on the child who had never asked to be born. From the moment Heracles drew breath, Hera set her hatred upon him. She delayed his birth so that another child, Eurystheus, weak, petty, and royal, would claim the throne destined for him. She sent serpents into his cradle, hoping to silence the boy before he could learn to cry. But Heracles, still an infant, rose from sleep, seized the snakes in his fists, and crushed them like dry twigs. Even then, the world knew what he was. He grew vast and wild, his body swelling with strength that could split trees and kill lions before he reached manhood. He trained in every art, fought with spear and bow, and learned music and philosophy, though these sat awkwardly in his hands, like jewelry on a butcher. He was married young to Megara, a noble wife who bore him children and gave him something like peace. But peace was not in Hera's design. She clouded his mind with madness so deep and consuming that he no longer saw what was real. He heard war where there was laughter. He saw enemies where there were sons. And in a night of screams and firelight, Heracles slaughtered his own wife and children, carving his name into history with the blood of those he had loved most. When the madness lifted, there was no defense, no excuse, only silence and ruin, and a man who had been broken not by sword or enemy, but by the gods themselves. He could have died then. He should have died, but the fates were not finished. The oracle at Delphi told him there was a path to atonement, not peace, not forgetfulness, but something close to redemption. He was to serve Eurystheus, the petty king who had taken his throne, and obey every command given, no matter how demeaning, no matter how deadly. And so began the 12 labors, tasks crafted not to cleanse, but to kill, to break his spirit, snap his bones, and remind him that even the strongest man in the world was still a pawn in the hands of kings and gods. The first task was the Nemean lion, a beast with hide so thick no blade could pierce it, a predator that had terrorized the valleys and forests until no hunter dared approach. Heracles cornered it in its lair, cast aside his weapons, and choked it to death with his bare hands, ripping the air from its lungs as it thrashed and bit and clawed. He skinned it with its own claws and wore the pelt as armor, the head as a hood, a living monument to brutality endured and delivered. Then came the Linnaean Hydra, a serpent of 9 heads, each one sprouting 2 more when severed, a venomous abomination born from the muck of the swamps and the nightmares of men. Heracles fought it with fire and sword, cauterizing each neck as he cut, until no heads remained to hiss or regrow. He dipped his arrows in its blood, poison so deadly it would blacken even divine flesh, because a hero without weapons is only a victim with good intentions. He cleaned the Augean stables, home to thousands of cattle left to rot and wallow in filth for decades, not with shovel or patience, but by tearing rivers from their course and forcing them to flood the muck in a single day. He hunted the Ceryneian hind, sacred to Artemis, faster than any wind, and caught it not with violence but with endurance, chasing it for a year through mountains and frost until it collapsed, exhausted, in his arms. He brought down the Erymanthian boar, a mountain-dwelling terror with tusks like plows, by driving it into snowdrifts too deep to flee. He killed the man-eating birds of Stymphalus with a storm of arrows and noise. He tamed the Cretan bull, subdued the mares of Diomedes that fed on human flesh, wrestled the Amazon queen Hippolyta for her girdle, and left chaos in his wake. He stole the cattle of Geryon, a 3-bodied giant, and killed him in a sunless land with a poisoned arrow through the ribs. Each labor grew heavier, darker. Each triumph cost more than the one before. The 11th labor sent him to the far west, where the earth ended and the sky began, to steal the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, guarded by nymphs and a dragon that never slept. Heracles did not fight the beast. He found Atlas, the Titan cursed to hold up the sky, and tricked him into retrieving the apples by offering to bear his burden. When Atlas returned, intending to leave Heracles in his place, the hero smiled, asked for a moment to adjust his cloak, and when the sky was passed back to his shoulders, he took the apples and left. Strength was useful, but wit could win where fists could not. The final labor was the darkest. He was ordered to descend into Hades, to the land of the dead, and return with Cerberus, the 3-headed hound who guarded the gates of the Underworld. No mortal had entered and returned before. But Heracles, who had already borne madness and murder and the hatred of heaven, did not falter. He descended through the black, past the ghosts of those he had killed, past the shades of unburied men who begged for memory. He found Hades, the god of the dead, and asked, not demanded, not stole, for the beast. And Hades, perhaps moved by respect or curiosity, or the weariness of one who sees the end of all things, allowed it, so long as Heracles took Cerberus by strength alone. And so he wrestled the beast in its own darkness, took the jaws and the paws and the fury and mastered it, not through violence, but by will. He led it into the light, and with that, the labors ended. But Heracles' suffering did not. He returned to the world a legend, but legends once forged are never free. He wandered after, restlessly, dragging behind him the weight of his own name. He fought wars, built cities, took wives, fathered children. But nothing healed him, not the glories, not the applause, not the love of people who only saw the lion's skin and the poisoned arrows, and not the broken man beneath. Hera still hated him, the gods still used him, and the fates still spun. He had done the impossible 12 times over, and still the world demanded more. He should have been allowed to rest. He had earned it 100 times over, by bleeding for kings who feared him, by serving gods who tormented him, by enduring 12 labors that would have killed any other man a dozen different ways. But Heracles was not like other men. He had walked into the underworld and walked out again. He had strangled lions and split mountains and held the sky on his shoulders, while gods plotted and mortals cowered. And still, for all his strength and all his scars, peace slipped through his hands like dust. He had not been born for peace. He had been born for suffering. And the world, knowing this, never stopped asking more of him. He wandered after his labors were done, not with purpose but with inertia, the way a boulder continues to roll long after the hill is gone, too heavy to stop, too dangerous to leave where it lands. He moved through kingdoms like a storm, offering aid where it was asked, fighting monsters that dared to rise, challenging kings who ruled unjustly, bedding women who welcomed him, and offending those who feared the size of his shadow. He married again, not for politics, not for legacy, but because he wanted something that resembled a life. Her name was Deianira, and for a time she softened the edges of his anger, soothed the hollowness left behind by the labors. They traveled together, built a home together, and in her eyes he saw something he had not known since his first wife and children lay dead at his feet. A flicker of the man he might have been, had Hera never whispered madness into his mind. But love for Heracles was never simple. Fate followed him like a curse, and jealousy always walked half a step behind. When they came to a river swollen with flood, they met a centaur named Nessus, who offered to carry Deianira across while Heracles swam. She agreed, and in the middle of the current, Nessus turned on her, trying to force himself upon her before Heracles could reach them. The hero loosed a poisoned arrow, tipped with the venom of the Hydra, and it pierced the centaur's chest. Nessus, dying, knew he could not kill Heracles with strength, but he could wound him with deceit. With his last breath, he told Deianira that his blood, if kept and applied to Heracles' garments, would ensure his fidelity forever. She, not knowing, not understanding, gathered it. She believed him. And the seeds of Heracles' death were sown not in rage, not in war, not in vengeance, but in the quiet fear of being forgotten. Years later, when Deianira suspected Heracles had found warmth in another's arms, as he so often had, she anointed a tunic with the blood, thinking it a love charm, thinking it would bind his heart to hers. She gave it to him with trembling hands. He put it on without thought, and almost at once the pain began. It was not fire, it was worse. The venom burrowed beneath his skin like worms, ate at the flesh, gnawed at the muscle, blackened the blood. He tore at the tunic, but it clung to him, fused to his skin like a second burning layer. He screamed, and the mountains answered. He leapt into rivers, but the water only hissed and boiled. He begged the gods to kill him, but no lightning fell. He smashed trees, shattered rocks, hurled boulders, but nothing dulled the agony. Deianira, realizing what she had done, hanged herself in horror. Heracles was left alone, consumed not by the blade of an enemy or the madness of a curse, but by the well-meant hand of the woman he loved. He did not die that day. He could not. The son of Zeus, the lion of Greece, the breaker of monsters, was too strong to simply collapse. So he built his own funeral pyre, carried the logs up the slope of Mount Olympus, laid them in a wide circle, and climbed atop it. But no one would light it. His friends wept. His companions stood frozen. No man wanted to be the one to burn the hero who had once held the heavens. No man dared place the torch. Only Philoctetes, a young warrior not yet cursed by his own story, stepped forward. He lit the fire. The smoke rose to the sky, thick with resin and death, and as the flames licked Heracles' body, Zeus himself looked down, not with pride nor with pity, but with the inevitability that only the King of Gods could understand. He had created this son. He had set him on this path, and now, at last, he would bring him home. As the fire consumed his mortal flesh, Zeus struck the pyre with thunder, and from the ashes rose Heracles, reborn not in body but in essence, lifted from the mortal world and brought to Olympus. There, among the gods who had cursed and tormented and tested him, he took his place, not as a guest, but as one of their own. Hera, who had hated him from the womb, offered a truce and gave him her daughter Hebe, goddess of youth, as his wife. Whether it was reconciliation or surrender, no one could say, but Heracles, the man who had lived as a beast and died as a legend, was now a god. His mortal story ended in agony, but his myth endured in glory. Statues rose, cities were named, prayers were spoken. But those who remembered him best did not remember the lion's skin, or the club, or the labors. They remembered a man who had killed his own children and never stopped paying for it, who had lifted the sky and still could not escape the weight of his own grief, who had fought monsters only to become one in the eyes of those who feared strength without gentleness. He was not perfect, he was not kind, but he was Heracles, and no name before or after would carry as much sorrow, as much fire, as much strength. He had walked through madness, war, shame, exile, torment, and fire, and on the other side of it all, he had become immortal, not because the gods chose him, but because the world could not forget him. The greatest wars are not sparked by hunger or borders or gold, but by the slow poison of pride, and the gods, for all their power and wisdom, were never immune to the sickness of being worshipped. The world had been tamed, gods ruled from Olympus, men built cities in the shadow of old ruins, heroes came and went like summer storms, but beneath the marble columns and sacrificial altars, the air had begun to crackle again. The age of Heracles had ended, and the gods had withdrawn somewhat from the affairs of mortals, satisfied perhaps that their dominion had been restored. Yet even as they watched the world from above, sipping ambrosia and sharpening vendettas, they could not help but meddle, because eternity brings boredom, and boredom in a god is always dangerous. And so it was not ambition or conquest that brought about the Trojan War. It was a wedding, and a single golden apple. The wedding in question was no ordinary union of mortals, but a forced celebration between a mortal man and a divine woman. Peleus, a brave but unremarkable king of Phthia, was chosen not for greatness, but for safety, for he was the one man the gods could trust never to threaten their rule. And Thetis, a sea nymph of terrible beauty and ancient blood, was the bride. Though she had once caught the eye of Zeus himself, he had recoiled when the fates whispered that she would bear a son greater than his father. And so, fearing the same fall that had swallowed Uranus and Cronus before him, Zeus cast her down, forcing her into marriage with a mortal to avoid his own overthrow. There was no joy in the match. only necessity and a thin veil of celebration. The gods gathered on Mount Pelion for the feast, and for a moment the heavens themselves held their breath. The wine flowed. Music rang through the clouds. Apollo plucked his lyre. The muses sang, and all was well, until Eris, goddess of strife, appeared uninvited. She brought no song, no gift, no blessing. Only a single apple of gold, gleaming and etched with a phrase that would echo through 1,000 battlefields. To the fairest. She cast it at their feet and vanished. And in that instant, everything changed. Hera, queen of the gods, saw the apple and claimed it. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, stepped forward and did the same. Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, laughed and reached for it too. 3 goddesses, 1 prize, and no judge among them bold or foolish enough to settle the matter. Zeus, who had seen the ruin pride could bring, refused to choose. Instead, he cast the burden downward into the lap of fate, into the hands of a mortal boy playing at nobility. Paris, Prince of Troy, a shepherd in the hills by choice, but royalty by blood, was chosen to judge, not because he was wise, nor brave, nor just, but because the gods saw in him the perfect vessel, handsome, vain, susceptible to beauty, and unburdened by wisdom. They came to him in secret, descending upon the slopes of Mount Ida in all their splendor. Each goddess made her case. Hera offered him power, kingdoms beyond counting, dominion over men. Athena promised glory, victory in battle, the cunning of generals, and the respect of all Greece. But Aphrodite, smiling with the patience of someone who always wins, offered the most dangerous gift of all, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, who knew nothing of politics or fate, who had never read omens or heard the groaning wheels of prophecy, chose beauty. And so the apple passed to Aphrodite, and the fates began to stir. The woman in question was Helen, queen of Sparta, wife of Menelaus, sister to Clytemnestra, daughter of Leda and Zeus, raised among kings and desired by all who had ever looked upon her. When Paris arrived in Sparta, some say under the veil of peace, others say with seduction in his eyes, Helen did not resist him. Whether by divine enchantment or her own will, she left with him, boarding a ship bound for Troy, leaving behind a husband, a kingdom, and 1,000 burning questions. Menelaus, shamed and abandoned, called upon the oaths once sworn by all of Helen's suitors, that if ever she were taken, they would unite to retrieve her, and they came. They came not for love, not for Helen, not even for Menelaus. They came because the winds of war had begun to blow again, and no one could afford to be left behind. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and brother to Menelaus, took command, not by right, but by force of will. He summoned the kings of Greece to join him, Odysseus of Ithaca, who tried to feign madness to escape the call, and was dragged from his fields. Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, hidden among women until he was revealed by his hunger for glory. Ajax the Great, Diomedes, Nestor, and hundreds more, each with their own reasons, each with their own gods whispering in their ears. It was not an army, it was a storm. And so, the ships were built, 1,000 hulls lined with oars and iron, waiting for the winds to carry them east. But the gods had not finished playing their games. The fleet gathered at Aulis, and there it sat, becalmed, unmoving. Artemis, angered by a slight, some say Agamemnon had killed one of her sacred deer, others that he had boasted too loudly of his skill, refused to grant wind, The sails hung limp. The sea was glass. The army grew restless. And the oracle spoke. Only the blood of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, would appease the goddess and lift the curse. And here, before the war had even begun, the first innocent blood was spilled. Agamemnon sent for his daughter under false pretenses, promising marriage to Achilles, and when she arrived, young and hopeful, she was seized, bound, and led to the altar. Some say Artemis took pity and spirited her away, replacing her with a deer. Others say she died screaming, betrayed by her own father. Either way, the winds returned, the sails filled, the fleet launched, and the greatest war in mythic memory began not with a clash of armies, but with the murder of a child and the silent satisfaction of gods who watched from on high. The ships moved east, cutting through sea foam like blades. Behind them, Greece was quiet. Ahead, the walls of Troy stood tall, ancient and unbroken, unaware that the horizon had begun to darken with the wings of vultures and the sails of doom. The storm had gathered, and it would not break for 10 long years. They had assembled in numbers never seen before nor since. Kings from every corner of Greece, warriors with bloodlines as old as the hills, sons of gods and mortals who had once dared to speak with them, veterans of older wars now standing shoulder to shoulder with boys who had never yet drawn real blood. From Sparta and Mycenae, from Ithaca, Pylos, Argos, and Thessaly, they came bearing swords, spears, ships, and pride, each bound to a cause they did not entirely believe in, but dared not walk away from. And as the fleet gathered on the grey coast of Aulis, it seemed to them they were no longer men, but part of some grand play whose ending had already been written in the stars. The ships stretched as far as the eye could see, 1,000 black hulls resting like wolves on the sea's edge, each one bristling with oars, each crewed by men hungry for gold, glory, or escape. The beach became a city of bronze and smoke, alive with shouting and sharpening, feasts and feuds, boasting and waiting. Agamemnon, brother to the wronged husband Menelaus, had claimed command not because he was the wisest nor the most beloved, but because he was the loudest and the most willing to bear the burden of kingship, like a shield he could use to strike others down. He moved among the camps in armor, even when there was no need, his voice full of command and calculation, his eyes sharp as daggers, yet even he could not command the wind. For though the ships were ready, the sea was not. Days passed, then weeks. The sails hung empty, limp as the hopes of the foot soldiers waiting beneath them. The sun scorched the beach by day and fled by night, leaving cold fires and darker thoughts. No wind came. The gods, silent for so long, had now made their displeasure known not in storms, but in stillness. And when stillness lasts too long, it turns to rot. Food grew scarce. Tempers frayed. Men brawled for nothing. Superstition flourished like weeds in spring. And then came the message, whispered through priests and oracles, confirmed again and again until none could deny it. Artemis was angry. Some said Agamemnon had killed one of her sacred deer. Others said he had dared to call himself the better archer. Still others whispered that it was not Artemis's wrath but Hera's, or Athena's, or even Zeus's own hand, reaching down to delay the war until the time was right. The gods never spoke clearly. They spoke in riddles and thunder and silence. But the demand, when finally it was understood, was unmistakable. The wind would not return. The ships would not sail. The war would not begin until Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter. Iphigenia, child of his house, young and untouched by all the sins her bloodline bore, was summoned under the lie of marriage, told she would be wed to the great Achilles, whose name even then already rang in warlike poetry. She came clothed in white, her eyes full of hope, her heart light as only the innocent can be. She was met not with garlands, but with ropes. Her mother, Clytemnestra, wailed and tore her hair. Achilles protested the use of his name and threatened violence, but Agamemnon stood unmoving, a king made of stone and pride and fear. He had already lost control of the army. He could not lose control of the gods. What happened on the altar is known and unknown. Some say Artemis, watching from above, took pity at the final moment, replacing the girl with a deer and whisking her away in silence to a hidden temple. Others say the knife fell, that her blood soaked the stones and stained the wind itself, that her scream still echoes through the cliffs of Aulis when the sea turns still. But whatever the truth, the ships began to move the next day. The wind came not with joy but with dread, cold and constant, as if the gods had sighed. The sails filled, the oars dipped, the ships turned eastward, toward Troy, toward war, toward the years of blood that waited like an open mouth. The men cheered, not because they were glad, but because they were afraid not to. They cheered because silence meant hearing what they had just done. They cheered because they were already too far from home to remember what it meant. And in the stern of his ship, Agamemnon stared at the horizon, where the sea met the sky, and he did not speak. Not of his daughter, not of the wind, not of the gods. He stood alone, already condemned, already doomed, already marked by a decision that would one day return to his doorstep, not with thunder or judgment, but with a knife held by his own wife. The fleet moved like an army of shadows, and before them, across the wine-dark sea, Troy waited, high-walled and proud, unaware that it had already been chosen by fate to burn. When the Greeks landed on the shores of Troy, they brought with them not only swords and fire and the vengeance of 1,000 kings, but the slow, merciless clockwork of doom. 10 years would pass before the walls would fall. 10 years of blood and grief and slow unraveling, not just of cities, but of the men who dared to take them. They came in waves, bronze-armored and sun-hardened, their banners snapping in the sea wind, their ships lined in rows like grave markers waiting to be carved. They set up camp along the beach, dug trenches, built altars, and offered their first sacrifices to the gods. But even then, they knew, though none would say it aloud, that this would not be a war of swift battles or clean victories. This would be a war of attrition, of pride against pride, of men fighting not for survival, but for memory. And at the heart of it all stood Achilles, the son of Peleus and Thetis, mortal king and immortal sea nymph. He had been hidden away as a boy, dressed as a girl among the daughters of kings, to keep him from the war foretold to take his life. But fate, patient and cunning, had waited, and when the war drums called, Achilles stepped from hiding, not as a boy, but as a flame made flesh, his body forged in divine blood, his strength unmatched, his wrath unchallenged. He was young, but he was already legend. And when he joined the war, he did not fight with restraint or strategy. He fought like a god who had learned how to bleed. Every man he struck died. Every battle he entered became a massacre. The Trojans, noble and proud, were driven back again and again, and the name Achilles began to crawl through their dreams like a sickness. But Achilles was not a tool to be wielded without consequence. He answered to no king, no law, no oath, not even to Agamemnon, high king of Mycenae and commander of all the Greek hosts, whose pride was as vast as the fleet he commanded. They were bound together by necessity and poisoned by contempt. Agamemnon saw Achilles as a sword, sharp, dangerous, and useful only as long as it obeyed. Achilles saw Agamemnon as a thief in a crown, a man who demanded respect but had done nothing to earn it. And so the war turned inward before it turned outward. The enemy was not yet Hector or Troy or fate, it was themselves. When Chryseis, the daughter of a Trojan priest, was taken as a war prize and Agamemnon refused to return her, Apollo rained plague upon the Greek camp. Corpses piled, pyres burned day and night, and the gods, who had once walked among the warriors in pride and delight, turned their backs. The solution was clear. Chryseis must be returned. But Agamemnon, furious at being defied, took Briseis, the slave girl gifted to Achilles, in recompense, not out of desire, but out of insult. And with that act, the High King ensured his own ruin. Achilles did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply stepped back. He withdrew from the war, returned to his tent, and refused to fight. The man who had broken Trojan lines like kindling sat in silence, his sword unworn, his wrath coiled, and the Greeks, once invincible with him among them, began to falter. The Trojans, sensing the shift, surged. Hector, Prince of Troy, brother of Paris, son of old Priam, took the field and became the wall that held back the sea. He was not a god nor the child of one. He was a man, a father, a brother, a husband, but he fought with the strength of one who knew he would die and still chose to stand. Without Achilles, the Greeks were pushed back. Their walls shook, their ships were threatened. Panic crept through the ranks like smoke through a city. And still, Achilles did nothing. He watched, unmoved, until the one thing he loved more than glory stepped into the fire. Patroclus, his dearest companion, whether brother in arms or something deeper, the poets never agree, donned Achilles' armor, hoping to turn the tide, to give the men something to rally behind. He fought like a flame, like a ghost of the hero who would not come. And for a moment, the Greeks believed they might win. But Hector met him on the field, and the armor could not protect him. Patroclus fell, pierced by a spear, his body stripped, his corpse dragged back behind Trojan lines. And when word reached Achilles, silence fell across the camp. It was the silence before the avalanche, the breath before the scream. He had watched kings beg for his aid and turned away. He had watched men die and felt nothing. But now, Patroclus was dead, and grief cracked open the dam that pride had built. Achilles did not return to war, he unleashed it. He rose in the morning, clad not in fine bronze but in grief and rage. He did not eat, he did not speak. He went to his mother, Thetis, and begged for new armor, forged not by mortal smiths but by Hephaestus himself, shields etched with the cosmos, greaves made for gods, a spear no man could lift. When he returned to the field, the sun itself seemed to pale. He did not fight, he slaughtered. He carved through Trojan ranks like death in a red cloak. Men begged, he did not hear. The river Scamander rose up against him, choked with corpses, and he fought the river too, forcing even nature to retreat before his wrath. And then he found Hector. The prince stood before the gates of Troy, alone, armored, trembling. He knew he would die. He knew his city would fall. But he faced Achilles nonetheless, with the courage of a man who chooses death over dishonor. The duel was short. Achilles chased him around the walls, mocking him. And when Hector finally stopped running, Achilles drove his spear through his throat. Not enough to kill him quickly. just enough to silence him. Then he tied the corpse to his chariot and dragged it, again and again, around the walls of Troy, while the people screamed and his parents wept. Not for war, not for justice, for Patroclus. There was no triumph, only rage. But even wrath has limits. That night, an old man crept into the Greek camp. Priam, king of Troy, wrapped in rags, eyes hollow, spine bent, walked through the enemy camp alone and knelt at the feet of the man who had murdered his son. He did not curse, he did not beg. He asked, "Let me bury him. Let me mourn him. Remember your own father, for he too will one day be alone." And for the first time in weeks, Achilles' fire dimmed. He wept. He returned the body. He let the king walk away. In that moment, for one night, the war paused, not in treaty, but in grief. And the gods, who had stirred all this from shadows and thrones, watched the most powerful man in the world lower his head, not in defeat, but in mourning. Yet Achilles knew, as all who seek vengeance must, that the end would not wait long. His own death was already walking toward him, and Troy still stood. The death of Hector had not ended the war, it had only deepened it. His body was returned, yes, and buried with honors beneath the weeping walls of Troy, but his absence left a silence in the city that no voice could fill. He had been its shield, its sword, its hope. And without him, the Trojans began to look at the horizon differently. Not as a line between sea and sky, but as a noose tightening. Inside the gates, old Priam ruled still, but his hands trembled when they signed orders, and his eyes had begun to sink into the hollows of his face. Paris, whose lust had begun this war, had become a shadow of himself, his bow still deadly but his courage diminished, his beauty fading as surely as the walls crumbled beneath the weight of siege towers and fire. And in the camps of the Greeks, where tents grew tattered and men grew old and battle-weary, no one spoke of home anymore, only of when the city would fall and how much of it would be left to burn. But fate had not yet claimed its final pawn. Achilles, who had carved a path of fire through the heart of Troy's defense, would not see the end. He had known it from the start. His mother had warned him that he could live a long life in obscurity, or a short one in glory, and he had chosen the latter. He had chosen songs, statues, and the roar of men shouting his name long after his bones had turned to dust. He had killed Hector, but in doing so, had stepped into the exact place fate required him to be. He died not in the chaos of the battlefield, but in a whisper, from an arrow loosed by Paris, some say guided by Apollo himself. It struck him in the heel, the only part of his divine-forged body left vulnerable. A wound so small, so ignoble, it would have been overlooked on any other man. But Achilles was not any man, and when he fell, the Greeks did not cheer. They mourned like sons mourning the father of their war. His body was recovered, dragged from the battlefield with blood in its hair and stories in its wake. His armor, now the most coveted relic in all the Aegean, was offered as prize, and the contest to claim it destroyed more than it honored. Ajax, second only to Achilles in strength and valor, expected the honor, but Odysseus, clever and silver-tongued, spoke better. The armor was given to him, and Ajax, humiliated, dishonored, and maddened by the slight, took his own life, falling on his sword in silence. His blood soaked the earth that had never belonged to him, and with his death, the last of the great blunt heroes was gone. Only the thinkers remained, and the thinker, Odysseus, began to weave the final act. Troy had stood for 10 years. Its walls, said to be built by Poseidon and Apollo in some distant, forgotten age, were unbroken. Its people, though wearied, still believed they might outlast the Greeks. But war does not favor the strong. It favors the patient. And in the firelit tent of a man whose strength was his mind, the plan was born. The horse, a gift, a trick, a trap carved in the shape of honor. The Greeks pretended to retreat, sailing away under the veil of night. They left behind the wooden horse, enormous and strange, adorned with offerings and symbols of peace. The Trojans, desperate for an end, starving for hope, dragged it into their city. Only Cassandra, cursed prophetess, screamed of what would come, but her voice, as always, was dismissed. Only Laocoon, the priest, dared to speak against it, hurling his spear into the side of the horse, crying that Greeks bring gifts even when they offer peace. But 2 sea serpents rose from the depths and devoured him and his sons before the altar. The gods had made their decision. The people obeyed. That night, the horse was brought into the city, through the Scaean gates, beneath a sky so clear it seemed the stars themselves had gathered to witness what must come. The Trojans feasted, lit fires, sang songs of peace. And when they slept, drunk and dreaming, the hatch in the horse opened. Odysseus, Menelaus, and the Greek elite spilled out like shadows from a grave, opened the gates, and signaled to the fleet, hidden just beyond the horizon, that the city was theirs. The rest came quickly. The Greeks poured in like floodwater. No mercy was shown. No prayer was answered. Priam was butchered at his own hearth. Hecuba was dragged away in chains. Cassandra clung to the statue of Athena and was torn from it, raped before the eyes of her goddess, her prophecies still ringing in ears that refused to hear. Andromache, widow of Hector, was taken as a slave, and her infant son, Astyanax, was hurled from the walls to ensure that no heir of Troy would rise again. Fires raged, temples fell, the sea turned black with smoke. Troy, golden, proud, defiant Troy, was broken. The Greeks stood victorious, but their triumph was bitter. They had won not by strength or honor, but by deceit, and the gods, who had once taken sides and played games, turned cold. For even the divine grew sick of the stench of burning flesh. Even Olympus turned its face when the children cried. The victors sailed away, one by one. Agamemnon to a wife who waited with a knife. Odysseus to 10 years of wandering. Menelaus to a wife reclaimed but never the same. The war was over, but the curse lingered. Troy burned, but its shadow remained, and those who had survived its fall would carry its ashes in their lungs forever. So ends the greatest war of the ancient world, not with justice, not with peace, but with ruin. A story not of heroes and villains, but of pride, betrayal, and the terrible cost of being remembered. The fires of Troy did not die quickly. They burned long into the days that followed the slaughter, fed not only by timber and cloth and bone, but by grief. The Greeks, who had sung of victory for 10 long years beneath battered tents and blood-stained banners, found the silence of conquest far more unbearable than the clamour of war. For there were no horns when the city fell, no golden laurels handed down by the gods. Only smouldering ruins echoing with the screams of widows and the slow, rusted sound of chains being tightened around the necks of those who had once called themselves free. They had won, yes, but as they stood among the ashes of a civilization greater than their own, even the proudest among them began to wonder whether they had destroyed something irreplaceable. The survivors of Troy were few and shattered. The old king Priam lay butchered at the altar, where he had once prayed for peace. His sons were dead, Hector in glory, Paris in shame. His daughters, torn from temples and thrown into the arms of murderers, bore the bruises of both gods and men. Cassandra, her eyes haunted with the knowledge of a future no one would ever believe, was claimed by Agamemnon, a prize of war, who would soon become a prophetess of death in his cursed house. Andromache, once wife to Troy's champion, was now a slave, and her child, a boy born of nobility and innocence, had been dashed against the stones so that no echo of Troy's lineage might rise again. The Greeks left nothing behind them but rubble and smoke, and still, it was not enough to cleanse the stain of what they had done. Their journey home should have been swift. The war was won. The winds were theirs again. But the gods had watched with narrowing eyes. The sack of Troy, brutal and unholy, had offended even those divine hands that had once pushed men toward it. Athena, who had once fought beside them, turned cold when her temple was desecrated, her priestesses slaughtered, her altars defiled. Poseidon, whose walls had once girded Troy in ancient loyalty, grew bitter as the city's towers fell to fire. Apollo, ever watchful, remembered the cries of his priest's daughter and the blood that soaked the altars. The gods had made this war, but men had made it monstrous. And so they exacted their vengeance slowly, not with bolts of thunder, but with storms, wreckage, betrayal, and madness. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae with a queen at his side and a prophetess in chains. His wife, Clytemnestra, had never forgiven the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia, and she met him not with kisses or garlands, but with a blade. He died not on a battlefield, but in the bath, cut down by the woman who once shared his bed, and the cousin who had whispered poison into her heart. Cassandra, seeing it all before it came to pass, died with him, unheeded until the very last scream. Odysseus, wily and silver-tongued, set sail for home and was cast adrift for 10 more years, cursed by Poseidon to wander as punishment for his arrogance. He faced cyclopes, sorceresses, monsters of sea and sky, watched his men die one by one, lost to hunger, hubris, or the laughter of false gods. When at last he returned to Ithaca, worn and unrecognizable, he found a kingdom eroded by time and doubt. His wife Penelope had waited, but she had waited in silence, her eyes shadowed with weariness, her faith slowly worn thin by years of absence and the endless company of suitors who measured the value of her patience in wine and flattery. Odysseus came home a king, but there was no feast in his honor, only blood and the cold, uneasy peace of a man who had seen too much. Menelaus, whose wife's abduction had kindled the war like a spark in dry grass, brought Helen home to Sparta. She was unchanged, radiant still, ageless in her beauty, and untouched by remorse. Whether she had loved Paris, or merely allowed herself to be taken by fate, no one could ever say. Menelaus did not ask. He placed her beside him again, as though nothing had passed between them but time. The poets would sing of her face, but the men who had watched their friends die for her would never forgive her. Some said her beauty was a curse. Others said she had been a pawn. But none could deny that the gods had wound the entire war around her throat like a necklace, and that all who looked upon her saw not a woman, but a memory of what they had lost. The rest of the Greeks, nameless and forgotten in the songs, returned to broken homes, barren fields, and a people who no longer remembered the cause they had fought for. They had dreamed of glory and found only sorrow. Some were shipwrecked, some were slain, some wandered until they no longer knew their names. The age of heroes ended not with thunder, but with rust. the blades dulled, the banners frayed, and the world moved on, dragging its blood-soaked feet into an age where gods no longer spoke and men no longer listened. Only the poets remembered. Only they kept the names alive: Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, Helen, Agamemnon, Priam, Ajax, Patroclus, shining like constellations in a night sky that no longer believed in miracles. The bards sang of Troy long after its ashes cooled, because to forget it would be to forget that men once believed in honor, in vengeance, in fate written by the hands of gods. But the world no longer held such men. Their bones were gone, their swords rusted beneath foreign soil. Only their stories remained, polished and repeated until truth wore away, and only legend was left. And perhaps that was always the point. In time, the gods fell silent, not in battle, not in fire, not even in shame, but in indifference. The world they had shaped with fury and love, with vengeance and desire, slipped out of their grasp as quietly as a river runs dry. There was no final war on Olympus, no rebellion like Cronus had mounted against Uranus, no prophecy like Zeus had feared from the womb of Thetis. The gods, who had once thundered across the sky and seduced queens in dreams, faded not because they were defeated, but because men simply stopped looking up. Once, every stone had held a name, every tree a spirit, every breeze the whisper of a divine whim. But in the ashes of Troy and the long silence that followed, people began to doubt the voices they once heard in the thunder. New kings rose, and they spoke not of Hera or Poseidon or Hephaestus, but of laws and armies, of gold and empire. They built cities not to honor the gods, but to tax the people. Temples stood still, but their priests no longer wept in visions or danced beneath blood-soaked moons. Sacrifice became ceremony. Ceremony became habit, and habit became hollow. The gods had once demanded awe, but awe cannot survive boredom. Some say the gods withdrew of their own accord, tired of the smallness of mortal hearts. Others say they died. If gods can die, not with violence, but with silence. Perhaps they saw the rise of new names: Pythagoras, Herodotus, Pericles, men who carried power in their pens and tongues, rather than in the favor of the heavens. Perhaps they saw that the age of mystery was ending. For when men learned to ask why, the world became a colder place. But even as temples crumbled and the old myths lost their teeth, the stories endured, not as commandments, but as echoes, not as truths, but as lessons. Zeus became not a ruler, but a symbol of power corrupted. Hera, not a queen, but the shape of resentment given form. Apollo's lyre became the voice of art. Athena's spear, the mind's sharpness. Hades, once feared, came to represent not death, but inevitability. And Prometheus, poor, fire-thieving Prometheus, was no longer cursed, but revered. For he had done what all great minds would try to do: steal from the heavens and give to man. The world moved forward, and the myths followed behind it, quieter now, like footsteps in old stone halls. The gods no longer appeared in the flicker of a torch or the gleam of a storm, but in paintings, in plays, in whispered verses passed from teacher to child. Homer wrote of Achilles and Hector long after they had vanished into the dirt. Hesiod mapped the genealogy of Titans like a priest drawing the bones of extinct beasts. 1,000 poets polished the legends until they gleamed with gold they had never truly worn, and the people listened, not because they believed, but because they remembered. And perhaps, in the end, That is all the gods ever truly wanted. Not obedience, not sacrifice, just memory. To be remembered is not to die. To be remembered is to become more than what you were. The Olympians had ruled the world for an age, yes, but in their fading, they became something greater. They became myth. And myth, unlike men, does not rot in the ground. It floats, it lingers, it waits. So when you hear thunder in a clear sky, or find yourself staring at the sea too long, or wake from a dream that feels older than your blood, know that you are not alone. The gods are not dead. They are merely sleeping, watching, waiting for someone to call their names again. Because nothing loved by man ever truly disappears. It becomes a story, and stories never die.